if we look at the basic demographics and projected availability of water, we see that today the world water supply amounts to about 9,000 cubic meters per person per year. That's if we distributed it evenly, which we don't. By 2025, with increased population and dwindling supplies, that number will fall to 5,200. But these averages don't mean much. By 2025, 3 billion of the world's poorest people, that's about 1/3 of the global population, will likely be living with less than 1,700 cubic meters per year. And that's actually below the official level of water stress. So the water gap is not simply a supply and demand problem. It's also an economic problem, a gap in access. And that gap is regional. The most water-poor region of the world is South Asia. And over the next decade, the gap between Asia and the rest of the world will continue to grow, more or less quickly, depending upon our climate change strategies. Now, if we pursue robust economic growth through globalization, relying on fossil fuels, we see Asia's water use doubling. It's the top line in this graph. And you can see that right now it's already 4 times the level of water use in North America. If we pursue a much more conservation-minded strategy and also emphasize equity, the long-term impact would be a drop in Asian demand, as shown here. But for this decade, the growth curve would actually be even steeper. Now, that's why China wants to move 1 billion cubic meters of water from its southern rivers to Beijing, which unfortunately is one of the world's driest megacities. Okay, so here's a big concept we want to introduce. Virtual water. Virtual water is the water embedded in products or services, which means that virtual water is all about trade. Now, this concept of virtual water is important because it helps us see some other emerging dilemmas. For example, if we return to the question of alternative sources of energy to fill our energy gap, we discover that there are water costs embedded in those alternative sources, and some of them are staggeringly high. As a baseline, petroleum extraction and refining require about 90 to 190 liters per megawatt. Coal-based production costs about 900 liters, or about 10 times as much as oil. But nuclear power, depending on the type of generation, can be 100 to 10,000 times as thirsty for water as oil. And the water cost of soybean diesel, just for the irrigation of soybean diesel, could be as much as 1 million times that of oil. And if cheap energy was the foundation of our modern economy, we've also depended on virtually free water to run our current economy. But this is really a forecast about the water ecology more than the water economy. So I want to spend a few minutes to talk about how something called peak ecological water. And to understand it, we need to think about the concept of ecosystem services. These are the integrated services that an ecosystem provides, and they fall into 4 categories. Provisioning, such as the production of food and water. Regulating, such as the control of climate and disease. Supporting, such as nutrient cycles and crop pollination. And cultural, such as spiritual and recreational benefits. Now, these are the benefits, these are the services that the ecosystem provides simply by being there. And all of these have concrete values to humans, even if we don't always measure them. And a very important characteristic of these services is that they depend upon each other. These are a system of integrated services, not a list of resources that we can isolate. Now, we might be tempted to think about water as the new oil, but it's not really an accurate analogy. Water is a renewable resource. But that renewal depends upon having an ecosystem that is intact and working effectively to provide its services. As we draw more and more water out of natural ecosystems for various human needs, the value of water's ecosystem services begins to fall. And at some point, the loss of value as a result of taking water out of the ecosystem exceeds the value we get from taking it out of the ecosystem as a whole. The point where these intersect is peak ecological water. That means we have to pay attention to both these numbers, the value of human services and the value of ecosystem services. And what peak ecological water gives us is a recognizable limit that we can use to manage both our human water needs and the resilience of the larger environment. It's a measure that balances human needs with environmental needs. Whether we see the carbon and water stories as problems of resource constraint or as new measures of well-being, they will be key drivers of turmoil in our global political systems. And to be clear, these are political issues, at least as much as they are environmental or economic issues. And we will need to respond to these issues in the context of a difficult transition. The traditional means of exercising power are weakening, and novel methods are slowly emerging. We find ourselves here in the power forecast in an awkward gap between the growing need to change and a declining ability to change. It's tempting to see the global power dynamic as simply a continuation of the long history of instability and cascading risks. The challenge of the 2010s, however, is distinct. It arises from a collision of issues that would each individually be seen as massively disruptive. The first is the declining legitimacy of many of the political institutions built up in the post-World War II era. Trust in the ability of leaders to respond effectively and fairly to complex problems was plummeting. Now, this is a picture from a couple years ago. That's Ben Bernanke and Henry Paulson, two American economic leaders of the time. And the hand holding up the word fail in the back, that's actually something of an internet meme of responding to things that are just massively gone wrong with just that one word, fail. And it's now the internet is infiltrating its way into politics. And you can think about like the political turmoil surrounding the Obama administration's inability to respond effectively to the BP oil rig disaster. Now, that stands out for me, but I'm sure you can think of the parallels that hit closer to home. Meanwhile, political figures in both developed and developing countries increasingly rely upon subnational affiliations, religious, cultural, regional, to maintain their power. Dependence upon the most partisan elements in these interest groups leads to increasingly extreme positions, making nuanced, negotiated outcomes harder to achieve and sustain. Added to this is the overarching problem of the global climate. Now, it's important to recognize that climate is a complex problem and may end up being a driver for both global cooperation and innovation. The question then is whether the delegitimization and decentralization of power will serve as forces of creative destruction or just destruction. And how we handle either one will come down to power, which can mean a variety of things. Political scientists generally refer to coercion and dominance as hard power. This is what most people think of when they hear the word power, military forces and the like. In recent decades, we've come to recognize that cooperation and influence can be another form of power, soft power. As technologies of communication spread, the use of hard power has become more difficult. It's getting easier and easier to just take pictures of things on the battlefield, and it's harder and harder to control information. And these same technologies, however, have made the use of soft power much easier. But technologies of sensing, of mobility, and of distributed participation have begun to blunt the impact of soft power too. People are less and less simply consumers of information, and more creators of it. Minorities and the disenfranchised can more readily find each other and cooperate, and speak back against the dominance of mainstream cultures. Soft power sought influence through creating global identities. Now we're in a world where our technologies allow us to craft our own individuated and fragmented identities. When we look to 2020, we see the real possibility of a new model of power emerging in this environment, adaptive power. This is a model of power that focuses on coordination, not coercion or cooperation, on resilience rather than dominance or influence. It's a model that finds strength in diversity, where flexibility and innovation matter more than strength or adherence to tradition. The Institute believes that adaptive power is likely to become the key to understanding global politics in the 21st century.